And I have been, okay. I have been researching on how can the private sector play a role in social and environmental development and do so profitably. And I guess the reason that I'm here is my work in Bangladesh right now, where I'm studying the circular supply chain of lead-acid batteries. So Bangladesh has seen this exponential increase in the number of electric vehicles that are providing last mile connectivity to millions of people. But while doing that, they're also using and disposing millions of lead acid batteries, which is going into recycling, but going into informal recycling or not environmentally responsible recycling. So we see an example of a circular supply chain that's not really working the way that we would like it to work. So yeah, super excited to kind of contribute to the conversation here. What can the private sector do? What kind of business models can we think about to bring in circularity in the conversation for battery technologies besides lead acid, lithium, and so on, right? So yeah, super excited to be here. Thank you.
No, we're excited to hear. And when you think about that, right, we're talking about not only the practical application, but when can we not repeat other mistakes? What can we learn from not only what's going well, but okay, the lead batteries being recycled, where's that waste going? What are the consequences of that? So I think there's a lot of value in that. And then John, last but not least.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me here. Really excited about this panel, and I think a unique perspective that I bring. My role is Senior Vice President of PYXERA Global, really focusing on rooting that most of the solvable problems in the world are already, those solutions already exist in the communities in the world as we know it. 80% of the world lives on reduce, reuse, repurpose behavior just to live, and really trying to find out net positive business models of how we can transform and change and scale reuse, repurpose in a different way, and consider instead of being stuck in this piloting of extraction over and over again. Some of our work that we really speak to is community understanding, also the private sector opportunity, and that's the work with the Circular Supply Chain Coalition is really trying to take together leading private sector companies, leading SMEs, and taking that whole supply chain that exists, but really trying to find a way to incentivize it and make it valuable for clients and customers to procure locally before globally.
You know, you inspired me. Years ago, I heard a scientist say, extraction is boring. And it was just said almost like an insult of like, aren't we more creative than that? Aren't we more capable than that? And I think that really ties into what you just said as a theme of we have so much more of an opportunity. And that ties into, you've also worked quite a lot with the Circular Supply Chain Coalition and partnered with FedEx. Could you share a little bit more about that, what that partnership looks like, and then how that ties into local procurement, and how we do this in a practical, effective way where FedEx wants to be involved and other people?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, first of all, I mean, the coalition itself is combined of really amazing, diverse thought leaders across the space. So whether that is Climate Kick in Europe or First Mile Value Chain based in Pittsburgh, actually, or FedEx who's funding it, it's really built on trying to look at true circularity. And I think one of the times we talk about circular economy, no one talks about logistics, right? I mean, if you look at one of the biggest value propositions of the US economy, it's always been the movement of goods. And about 2021, we started working with them on their circular logistics transition. And it became just kind of a light bulb going on of how we can look at railway and FedEx's supply chain and really trying to work with their companies to really unlock that opportunity. So they've been a great partner and a great ally, wanting us to work with other logistic companies as well.
So if you don't mind building off of that, what is unique about this moment as we sit here on this panel, as we see what's going on, as we see priorities changing for some companies and even what they will and won't talk about, yet circularity seems to be a common sense kind of thing, but only if you get it.
I mean, look, I'm rooted in a nonprofit, and I really believe, honestly, in environment and social and governance, right? I think that's important. But I think where we've moved is to a place of supply chain security. Companies now must secure their supply chain. It's not a matter of just doing well. If you're not procuring locally, if you're not getting your feedstock locally, then really, how can you actually make the stuff you need to, given that there's 110 global conflicts? We heard about China's control of all mineral chains in the world right now. Companies need to actually get a competitive advantage and adapt quicker to the changing environment. And I think number two, just to highlight, I think a little bit too of where the opportunity is we all talk about extraction, like how many new mines we need to open up and what are the opportunities on deep sea mining, which gives me shivers. What if we actually talk about urban mining? And what if we did something truly unique? We take the $17 trillion last year that all governments gave a lot of extractive businesses, and we actually invested in onshoring jobs and local supply chains and investing in building local productive domestic production in markets across the world. This has a marketplace that can be done. What is missing is the appetite for a co-investment opportunity to bring that to market. But I think now with companies in a different space where it's not just an ESG thing, it's a business creation opportunity imperative. I think that's what's changing, and that's what we're excited about.
I think you also accidentally or inherently address some of the tariff nightmares that are going on, right? I mean, if we are less worried about how we're getting things in and out because we know where our supply chain is and we have more control over it, some of these problems solve themselves. Not magically everything, let's be realistic, but we do take some of the worries off the table. With that, Milo, can you kind of share what we can learn from other countries that have already done this or further down the path? And hopefully that idea of how can we build off of what's just been talked about with John?
Absolutely. I think with regard to this question of critical minerals and the potential for circularity, there's really 5 models right now. There's the developmental states of Japan and South Korea. There's China, which is, of course, just a unique example given the decades now of mineral processing expertise and the gargantuan size of its domestic industry. And then there's the EU and the US as these, more free market analogs that are perhaps more comparable just from a political economy standpoint. I think with regard to China, I can only say again, the economies of scale are first help. There, of course, are implementation policies within 5-year plans that have helped this. Japan and South Korea both as well have various funding measures, kind of benchmarks for mineral circularity. But I think the EU is where we should really think about and concentrate. There are several landmark policies. The Circular Economy Act, which has been a longstanding pillar of the Green Deal, is one that I think we should view as one in sentiment. It's not rigorously binding or enforcing, but kind of sets this pillar that creates room for interesting ideas about how you think about the logistics of circularity that I think John mentioned very well. And the first of that is the battery passport, which is not a EU mandated thing. It is this kind of bizarre public-private system that essentially creates a QR code on lithium-ion batteries so that the materials can be tracked and that can be traced. And that sounds kind of dull and boring, but actually it's essential. And it's essential to the ecosystem of ensuring that these materials are contained for circular uses. And I would say that's actually one of the US's greatest challenges. The US right now has a production tax credit for hydrometallurgic recycling of battery materials. And that's great. It helps kind of kickstart the industry. But the reality is the US has not signed on to the Basel Agreement in the way that these other countries have. And the EU has specific laws that prevent the export of e-waste. With the US, as we are seeing, the first generation of battery storage, first generation of Teslas starting to hit the dust, there's no binding law to say that that battery cell has to go to redwood materials or Li-Cycle for recycling. In fact, the economics of that may mean it just gets sent to some other country for a small amount of use and then rots in a landfill. So if we're to really think about circularity, I think one of the areas where the US struggles from our political economy perspective, we are a carrot-centric industrial policy approach. And we're going to need to figure out sticks that align with the urgency of securing mineral supplies. And also, hopefully, the fact that we just don't want things like lithium-ion batteries going into landfills for toxicological reasons. So I hope that analog sets up some stuff for us to chew on.
I think that's wonderful. And do you have anything to add to that? Because you've also seen, Amrita, quite a lot of how internationally things can be applied or approached differently than how we do it in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are a couple fundamental things that don't differ between boundaries. So one is the fact that recycling operations is a for-profit operations, right? Like these these companies need to be making money, and so they need to be they need to have two things. One is a market where they can sell their secondary recycled, reclaimed materials at a fair value, and a market where they can have access to a reliable supply of feedstock, which is the scrap materials. And that kind of brings us back to this idea of reverse logistics. Well, do we have a scalable supply chain, a reverse supply chain that can actually, that from which we can acquire the materials required to have these recycling facilities operate at capacity that is profitable for them? So that would be kind of one thing that I think is universal. And we see that recycling facilities close down in Bangladesh for lead acid batteries, or they close down in the US for glass recycling, for example. And the second, I think, is what Milo said, is this kind of the carrots and the sticks, right? Like, we have these environmental regulations in the US and in developed countries, which is required because when you are recycling, you have a lot of toxic chemicals that you're dealing with. But when the regulatory burden for a company becomes so high that they find it more profitable to just send it out to Asia, send it out to Africa, then you're displacing that toxic problem from the US to a different community. And not just that, the yield that you're able to achieve in these less developed countries, that the amount that you're able to extract from the scrap is lower. So you're essentially leaving money on the table, right? And that's economic loss. So I think that kind of the balance of the carrots and the stick is really quite important. And tariffs can play an important role, right? Like, if you increase the export tariff on scrap batteries, then there's an incentive for that recycling supply chain to be more domestic.
No, and I think that you bring up a lot of good points, all of you do, about what are the levers that need to be pressed or pushed, whether it is a tariff, whether it is a stick or a carrot, on how do we scale this? How do we work on this? And Justin, I want to ask you about that because you've really looked at this from a couple different areas, but I'm curious about the barriers, the technological ones, the business ones that you see we need to break down to be successful in this area.
Yeah, well, for starters, I think there's a growth component that recycling doesn't really, it can't quite get us to the growth in materials that we need. And so we need to kind of think outside of just the recycling paradigm, but also where can we obtain these new materials to meet the demand, but still like sort of trying to solve that problem through the lens of circularity. And as what I usually do with my work is I work with heavy extractive industries. And you know, they have a primary target whenever they're digging up an ore or they're drilling a well. They're either after, you know, the copper ore, or in the case of critical minerals, they would be after the zinc ore, and then they're going to leave a tailing. They're after the oil that's in the ground, and they're going to discard the produced water or the cuttings that, you know, were generated during the process. And this is a lot of materials that are being moved around in the surface of the earth daily. Due to these operations. And most of them are considered a waste and they go into a landfill. One example, produced water. It's a fluid that's very salty. It has a lot of dissolved things in it. It's co-produced with oil and gas. And it's generally of no economic value. In some parts where you have limited reuse or disposal options, it has a negative value. But it also contains a lot of lithium. And if we're producing, you know, nearly 3 billion liters of this stuff a day, like maybe we should you know, use that opportunity to start adding value or valorizing this waste stream to offset some of these material growth demands that we need. And kind of related to like, well, that seems like a no-brainer. Like, why are we not doing that? Well, it's all relatively new. We really didn't know we needed this. We didn't really anticipate the growth of lithium 10 years ago. And the shale boom has really created this, and I guess tangentially created this surplus of water, right? So we're kind of behind on developing and benchmarking technologies that can actually utilize this waste. And so I think that is from a technology side, we need to scale up. We need to proof extraction technologies that can actually handle these different types of ores. We're not talking about, spodumene or monzonite, something that we've been mining with for, the past 50 years or so, these older technologies. These are new things. These are pioneering tech that we need to scale up. We need a benchmark. And then we need a regulatory environment that can kind of handle this. Because right now it's a waste, but if it's worth something, then it's not a waste. Then is it a mineral? And if it's a mineral, then somebody has a right to that mineral. So we have to kind of decide these either at the state level or I don't know. They're big problems that are going on right now. So the great minds in the room will probably contribute to figuring that out. So.
And I'm kind of a geek in this area. I asked some folks that do a lot of fracking in Western Pennsylvania and in West Virginia, and I said, who owns the tailings ponds? And they said, well, it frankly depends on the legal agreement that was made with the landowner. In some cases, they put the responsibility on the landowner, which means ironically right now you could have additional value out of something that you worry about. And in other cases, the company owns the responsibility to keep that tailings pond, which actually means the company now has additional value. But these are things that were not looked at. The cool part for me, and this is kind of gets back into the ethics piece, is the companies that did the ethical thing of saying we're responsible for the waste that comes out of this location now have additional value. The ones that said, hey, you know what, it's your problem now, don't have quite the same access to the value. So I kind of like that we don't always see karma come back in a legal setting or a business setting, but we have an opportunity with this to kind of look at that opportunity, which isn't always the case. So I know that doesn't mean happily ever after, but it is the idea that at least it bends in that direction, which I think can be exciting. So let me ask really all of you, but it kind of builds off of what you said. Who then should be taking the lead on this? If we are looking at lithium, is it the energy company, the natural gas company that has done the fracking, that has access to lithium? Are you bringing in geologists that know how to do extractive industries, that know how to take things out of waste, or may not know how to take things out of waste, they only know how to extract? How do we get the expertise we need to get things to scale? Because it feels like the recycling folks haven't monetized this the way we need. So that's open for everyone, but it is that idea of how do we build scope and scale with all the knowledge we have?
I want to jump in on that one. That's a really good question. I think a couple of things. When you're looking at this, first of all, framing this as an economic opportunity is important. So when you're looking at private sector, look, private sector has a lot of power, especially by industries. And when you look at what you just said about who owns the tailings, is it this family here? Is it this pond here? Who owns that? That's one of the problems that has to be solved. When you look at recycling itself, of why it doesn't necessarily work, is that the second it's sold to the consumer, no one's paying for the end of supply chain. So how can you be like a company like Apple, which has full end-to-end of their supply chain, or even IKEA to a degree, look at supply chain as a competitive advantage now? Because this is climate week. So let's be honest. We've passed 1.5 degrees. It's going quicker. There's 8 billion people on the planet, and we're sitting around saying like, oh, we have plenty of time. I think the way to frame it is those companies that can really look at net positive, not in an ESG context, but frame those businesses. For example, Philips, instead of selling how many light bulbs that are going to burn out at 1,000 watts, but instead selling lighting as a service and redefining their business model, it's not either or, it's and. So we need to find a profit motive to the recycling place where companies can invest in that as a feedstock, such as urban mining. 2, work with governments to say, I want this to be our industry. I want to make America great at remanufacturing, for example. Invest in that. And then 3, really look at VC opportunity in this space. As it was said, I think by Wyatt earlier, China has 5 times overcapacity on battery material right now. They do that. They know that, right? The United States, we can only process 25% of capacity. That means we are competitively behind. So how do we change our mindsets and don't look at recycling as, oh, it's nice, look at that little bottle. How is it framed in a different way of that is money on the table that we're leaving, let's go capture that back.
Just to add to that, and very kind of similar process in which I was thinking about it as well is, well, we teach about different business models, right? And leasing and swap is a business model that is just so, in tune with circularity. You can manufacture longer lasting batteries, for example, so more durable batteries. That's anyway directly better for the environment, but that allows a company an opportunity to keep selling that asset over and over to different set of people during the life of that asset. So that's allowing for more use out of that asset. And finally, because the ownership of that asset remains with the manufacturer or with the lessor, you now have a more concentrated set of used asset that is now more economic to send into recycling. So to me, like, I guess maybe I'm biased because I am a faculty in the business school, but like these new business models really can tackle some aspect of circularity.
We'll jump in on the notion of, and I am a geologist / geochemist, so some of the vernacular of business jargon doesn't really I don't know the words, but so would this be like a vertically integrated company that would manage the supply chain? I'm just thinking from like a oil and gas producer. It's like that is their core competency, is finding this resource and then sending it out to market. But then they're an upstream company. So like the midstream component is what would handle the water or the waste that I'm talking about. So it wouldn't necessarily be like, cradle to grave type of, because that material is handed off, the ownership is handed off at some point, right?
Right. So I think we can think of it as not just one company that owns all parts of the process, but there can be intermediaries that allow manufacturers to sell their assets in a lease model. So someone else is managing the lease, the collection of the payments, or like, maybe there's another service provider who's actually ensuring proper maintenance of the products or proper kind of maybe, remanufacturing of or extending the life of that lithium battery into a second life and so on. So there could be very many different players, but with that idea of this loop being complete and somehow these assets being kind of identifiable, almost like a battery passport, right? Where you can identify them, but within a company. And so you can retain the ownership of that asset at the end.
I was talking to a gentleman that owns a chemical company, and it kind of ties into this because he said, we started taking back our chemicals once we had sold them. We were already there. We were giving them new chemicals. We were taking back the used ones because we knew what to do with it. But I got paid to take it back. And then half of it, I knew how to dispose of it. The other half, I was able to reuse, or it was considered inert. And then I got a sustainability award for it. And it just felt almost like that shouldn't be fair because I made money, everyone celebrated me, my customers thanked me, and I made the whole process easier for them. And to me, even though we're talking about a battery rather than a chemical, this idea of that circularity, right? And maybe you do bring in an expert, right? I think that's part of it, this idea. There was a steel company that it turns out enough heat is generated by steel to usually do, depending on the company, 15 to 25% of their electricity use. But most steel companies say, I'm not in the electricity business. I don't know what to do something, even if the numbers are good. So I think that's the leap right now is we all know circularity is a common sense, logical thing. The numbers work, the theory works. It's that question of how do you take an extractive industry and say to them, you can do more, you can be more. And it's almost like the business model of diversification, but you've got to help have them understand that that's possible. How do we do that? I mean, we sit up here and we're all excited about it, but how do we take the FedEx of the world and have them talk to a natural gas company and see the circularity that for some of us is obvious and for some of us isn't? Because I mean, I love the word circularity, but I do think it's abstract for a lot of businesses and companies. And this will be kind of our final question, then we're going to put it out to the audience. So if you've got your burning question, get ready. Yeah. But go ahead, Milo.
I think policy is essential to guide this. We're talking about sticks and carrots. Smart policy is needed. If the market opportunity was there, it would already be done. So connective glue that way is essential. I think there's also been some really interesting developments in the past year or past couple of years with the Department of Energy positioning itself strategically as a kind of middle manager of offtake agreements for up and coming products, which from the investor standpoint is the key. If you're going to invest in a recycling facility, you're not going to do it unless there is clear offtake and a demand signal. And then I think it's important just to kind of, we're talking about climate technologies, circularity, and minerals, to stand back and say, with regard to climate tech and various minerals, we are just at various degrees of circularity implementation. Aluminum and steel are already circular commodities. You see that in electric arc furnaces. You see that in a similar process for aluminum. When you cut down to batteries, that's something that we're just starting. And it's important to acknowledge the time scales of that, and that it is not a panacea as well. Just for context, the battery recycling facilities are not going to be recycling batteries right now. They're going to be recycling scrap from the first battery cell factories in the US, trying to figure out how to make this stuff, because that's just not a muscle the Americans have yet. The second conundrum is that these facilities are specifically designed for nickel cobalt based batteries, not for lithium iron phosphate, which effectively cannot be produced outside of Chinese companies right now, full stop. It is also moving fast in global battery markets. LFP technology is clearly a winning technology compared to the nickel cobalt incumbent. There's one company in the US that can do both, and they're at pilot stage. The other issue is that regardless, the recycling doesn't get you graphite. It gets you the cathode anode materials. The graphite, it can many times be lost. And graphite is, when it comes down to the actual geopolitical risk, that's the real problem. Spherical graphite, the Chinese have been very clear, that is next in line for export restrictions. So there's work to be done there at an R&D stage. It's exciting to see solar recycling take place. Solar cycle now taking shape in Texas, AES being part of that synergy. Wind is at a later stage. It is more complicated to recycle blades and nacelles of wind turbines. We need R&D there. And great report on this from Columbia's Center on Sustainability from the law school that really outlines this. And I'll end with magnets, with sintered permanent magnets. This is the biggest risk of all right now. It's obviously top of headlines. And that's just super low TRL. We don't really know how to recycle magnets. It's a technology we just effectively are struggling to scale on the production side. And that paints the spectrum that, like, the Europeans, I didn't mention, have a Critical Raw Materials Act with 25% recycling goals that they're hoping to implement at member state levels by 2030. And is that going to include recycling permanent magnets that are at low TRL pre-pilot facilities? Is that going to include graphite for batteries, which their recyclers may not be able to do? So there are technical questions, and we need, as John mentioned, we need VCs in this space. We also need the ARPA-E's, France's ANR, these high-risk, high-reward types of grant funding that can really move the mile and help push these parts of circularity that are lagging, so that the markets can respond and get involved.
You want to close this out for a minute?
Yeah, I just want to take on the circular economy question, because definitions are relative to a degree. The term circularity, circular economy started coming out about 2010 when Ellen MacArthur went on her boat trip, and then private sector got a hold of it. And then this idea of the three principles became whatever essentially the company wants it to be. The way that we look at circular economy is kind of rather try to look at it first, the stakeholder you're speaking to. One, how do you have a material that can live not in perpetuity, but a long time? So materials with economic commoditized value that you can get the longest resource from. I mean, it's not so scientific. It's just, how do you get your business models to capture and build in a model to capture back the material over and over again as a competitive advantage and take care of your resource? I think one thing that's always challenging, it's also based on culture. If you look at a lot of that reduce, reuse behavior culture, the culture indicates the policy environment. The culture indicates how we're extracting or make wasting products and goods. For example, in the US, it's not how much I'm going to save, and that's what I'm going to worry about. It's how much I can make and how much I can produce. And that mindset shift, when we talk about circularity with companies, we're talking to CFOs, we're talking to procurement, we're talking to those folks, the ones that are embedded in that long-term risk or medium-term risk to really think through. So I think just from takeaways here, a lot of it's the perspective of who you're talking to and looking at it in the most simplest terms of getting the longest value out of the material that you can.
I almost see it as skill, will, infrastructure. And I know that's oversimplifies it, but it also puts buckets to a lot of nuance that we've got to work with. So let's turn it over to questions in the audience. I'm seeing a bunch of hands and a lot of excitement. In the back in the red shirt, I saw your hand go up at the very beginning when we started talking.
Could you repeat the questions that are asked for the people on Zoom as well?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a very insightful discussion. I'm just jumping off of what you said a couple of minutes ago about scaling, having subsidiaries and experts for one companies to focus on different aspects of the supply chain. This is something that China has done in Indonesia for nickel mining for years. And the problem with that now is that it's difficult to have policy that can hold them accountable. So then how do you sort of build that policy simultaneously while pushing companies to have these business ventures and experts come in and focus on the other?
So to try and paraphrase that, we're asking, how do you build a policy and hold people accountable and encourage them, but also add ethical constraints to do things the right way? How did I?
Keep it transparent. So
Yes.
that people actually know.
Yeah, and the transparency to build trust. Does anybody want to jump in for that?
I can try to take a crack at this. And I think this goes back to just transparency in a supply chain and like different players and what their actions are, and then how do you hold them accountable at the downstream as well as upstream. I don't know how exactly to do that, but I think with more and more traceability technology, maybe we can use some technology and some kind of contractual agreements, which, you know, if there is penalties associated with outcomes, essentially. But at the end of it, you're right that there needs to be policy that incentivizes someone to hold the other people accountable in the supply chain. But I'm hoping that we have some sort of technological innovations that allow for more traceability as well.
Questions over here, gentlemen?
My name is Nayan. I'm a contractor with the Rhodium Group. I have a basic question about policy. You mentioned that we need policy, but I have a question about the framing of those policies. Do you think that the framing, at least in the current environment, should be about national security, push for circularity, rather than talking about climate change, because that has become a disputed topic? Do you think if you focus on national security and try and convince the administration on the policy side, it would be a better way of pushing circularity going forward?
So to try and paraphrase that, it is the idea of almost that persuasion piece of, if you're talking about it through the lens of security and country security, especially with China having such a control in the market, do we benefit from using that lens to get people that may not have our shared priorities motivated? What do we think? No one wants to go on the record.
I'll do
Off
one.
the record.
I'll jump one here. First of all, I am not a policy person, so let me just frame that really quickly. Anybody here heard of the Americas Act? Hands, Americas Act. So this was bipartisan legislation. So Senator Bennett, Colorado, and Senator Landry, Republican, Louisiana. And they got together and put together the Americas Act, which was framing about $18 billion of subsidies and incentives for remanufacturing. The reason why it got across the hill was because of national security. It was positioned in that way. It wasn't positioned in an environmental steward way, climate mitigation. It was an act of looking at how we're going to defend our borders to a degree. So you can research that. That's public knowledge.
May I just jump in and say that I say this to the climate movement. What moves, to John's point, what moves anything in this town is national security, regardless of which party's in power. And it's difficult to even see the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction being passed in a world where there were not de-risking concerns at the top of the table. And those were an impetus to do so for the Democratic Party. And I think just thinking strategically about how these various technologies position in that reality in this town is an important piece to reckon with.
And I think you bring up several good points. And to oversimplify it, even if I don't want an EV, I do want my phone, right? So this idea that this is an issue across the board of who controls a lot of our communication, our transportation, a lot of industry and innovation. Right now, we have a very few amount of companies that are countries that have an immense amount of control. And that is something that people can all agree on. So I think, yeah, there is an opportunity there. That's a great point. Questions over here? Gabby? Yeah.
Gabriela from EMC.
Yes, I mean, I think so.
Oh, sorry, real quick. I was asked to summarize for those online, really asking about emerging economies and the amount of e-waste that goes into those communities.
So yes, a lot of e-waste goes into these economies, but I would differ in that I think they handle and process those wastes because, like to John's point, these are communities that know that you can use scrap to make materials out of it. This is kind of the whole jugaad innovation that we talk about. It's just that it's not done formally, it's not done efficiently. And so we're losing resources when this is happening, and we're creating toxic waste in these communities. So I think that's where the formalization of the e-waste recycling, doesn't matter the geography, needs to be in place. And if we can do it more in the developed countries with technologies that are less polluting, then that's even better.
Right, question here in the front row. Coming back to.
My name is Hodge. I grew up in Germany, so you're reaching the limits of incremental change. Thank you.
So to summarize, I think two observations there. That is, we are reaching the limits of incremental change. And then what does it look like to lean into the stick versus the carrot in the United States? What would you all like to see if we are using a stick? What does it look like for you?
I'll put myself on the
Off the
chopping
record.
block. There's some great literature from KU Leuven in Belgium that crunches the numbers. I'd recommend everyone checking it out. For all of the transition metals to 2050, what is the scale that recycling, production of secondary supplies can impact that primary supplies you would need from extraction? And the results, which are corroborated from other forecasters, imply that it's not until the 2040s that you actually start to see recycling even put a dent in the amount of minerals that we're going to need to extract. So there's a couple ways to approach that with new moral framings. One is trying to understand and get, as an environmental movement, get cozier with that difficult reality and figure out ways that the extraction of those metals can be done to empower countries, produce actual rents for countries. You look at a country like Chile has done actually a really good job comparatively to figure out how they can create equity and ownership and not at the expense of indigenous communities. That's one way that could help. That's the other way that we need to be thinking about this is the forecast I mentioned is a moving target. It's predicated on the demand growth of the incumbent technologies. We're talking about recycling, and that's important, but we can also talk about other forms of technologies that just phase out the need for some of this mining altogether. And focusing on a technology push strategy for those technologies. I was mentioning to our panelists earlier, the news this past week from CATL and BYD about sodium ion batteries having an energy density near LFP, one of them expecting costs to decrease 70%. That would create a very different scenario for the amount of cobalt and nickel that we would need to mine if that was to work out. And I say that with caution. But thinking about it as a multi-prong approach, yes, recycling is part of that, but also how does innovation play a role in just reducing the amount of demand we need? And then 3, the environmental movement reconciling that extraction is going to be part of this and it needs to be done carefully. And the ownership structures can empower communities or they cannot. And that's a choice to be made right now.
I think you brought up a lot of exciting things. And salt cell batteries, for those that's the first time they're hearing about it, there really is some innovation in that area. Carnegie Mellon University put together one that the Chinese then bought and took in country that it's been really quiet. And so the question is, are they perfecting it and we don't know about it, or has it not been perfected? There are questions. But it does change, frankly, some of the things we're talking about if it's been advanced, and we don't know some of those things. So I think this is a really great conversation to have for us to be paying attention to, is what does extraction look like and how do we take what we already have and use it? Justin, you look like—
Yeah, I was just going to comment on a stick that is not necessarily regulator imposed, but sometimes there are just physical limitations on the system. So with produced water, for example, there's limited capacity to recycle it. You can only, right now, they in Appalachian Basin, the Marcellus and the Utica, they're recycling the water, but they have to drill another well to take the water from this well to re-inject over here. And that is the only option. Well, at some point, they're going to stop drilling wells. And then, so right now, that's why they are looking at alternatives. And I think they really latched on to this idea that if there is some monetary value other than just refracking a well, then maybe we should start investing in this now. And that's going on in Texas too. Like they're making so much water in Texas that's coming out of their ears, and they can dispose of it in Texas. But you know what they're doing? They're causing earthquakes. So there's actually a policy initiative in place to shut down those saltwater disposal wells because there's this physical limitation. The system can only absorb so much of this water. So I think that is another thing that's probably going to drive recycling into the future, is that we're going to realize that we're out of landfill capacity. We're out of, these other alternatives. So.
Oh, good insight. All right. I've seen so many hands. I know we have about 4 minutes left. So let's do gentlemen in the very back of the room. So the question's about state municipal involvement in the policies that we're talking about, and whether that is carrot or stick, but just that idea of whether it's federal. We say policy, but what does that actually mean from a zoom in standpoint?
I think that's a really good question. And I will humbly say I don't have a sharper take, but would be really interested to look at, for example, California, where the scale of stationary storage, the scale of legacy EV growth is so robust. Are there examples that could be put in place to effectively contain these materials and prevent them from going to waste in third countries? So yeah, I don't know if anyone else does, but I don't have a strong answer.
I actually would super like to jump in on this one. It's a great question. And I think when you're focusing on the states, one of the states we're working with is Colorado. And they have money set aside for the Circular Economy Fund, where they're investing right now in recycling tires, textiles, and now we're talking to them about setting up one of our first hub and spokes actually in Pueblo, which is economically depressed. And also for the haulers, they're not allowed to dump critical minerals into landfills. So it's a two-pronged sword. I think when you're looking at a state like Colorado, the innovation of looking at the economics of getting there kind of first, super smart. So net positive is not, it's about how do we attract those businesses and attract those mindsets at the university level, student level, to come in here and invest in it. So that's one to put on your radar. Just, you can check it out. I can give you some information on it too.
All right, we're going to close out with our last question. And the woman here in the aqua, yeah, glasses.
Or other examples that prevent the consumer from that effort. Thank you.
All right, so just to summarize, it really is that question about the burden that goes on the consumer versus the burden that goes on either the manufacturer or other people, other than the fact that now that my iPhone is dead or I no longer want to use it, what do I do with it, whether that's an EV vehicle or something else?
Yeah, I mean, unless the consumer pain points are solved, circularity cannot occur, right? Like we cannot go into a world where a company is investing in circularity if their consumers are not happy with what they're doing. So I think that resolves the issue of the consumer pain point. Now that can just be a barrier in getting to circularity itself. But I think the swap models, for example, that we're seeing with the electric charging is also in developing countries, right? Like we now have in India, for example, there are these electric two-wheelers or three-wheelers that can go into a petrol pump, but instead of kind of filling gasoline, they just go into one of these how do you call it? Like a locker, like think of an Amazon locker, and they just kind of go and pick up a battery and swap with their own. And again, the swapping model itself kind of allows for circularity. So I think innovation is what really is needed, not just technologically, but like how do you provide that service to the customer that can address their pain points and do that in a smart way. And I think that perhaps is the stick is probably with the consumer and like telling the companies kind of like solve it for me, and kind of also the pressure from the geopolitical situation, also a stick for the companies perhaps to getting their act together.
So we are wrapping up from our timing standpoint, but I want to do two things now. First of all, I want to thank our panel for being here and contributing their knowledge and their thought for our wonderful discussion and benefit. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank them personally for giving me more hope and feeling like, all right, we can do some things here. I can see both the carrot and the stick and how we can make some impact. So that part is always exciting for me. And then I do want to really ask, is there a key takeaway you've all taken from other people on the panel? We've got experts up here, but you also get to learn from one another. So rather than have me do a bunch of closing remarks on what I've learned, I'd love just kind of rapid fire. Did you have a takeaway from this discussion that makes it worth your time to be here, or that you felt the audience would benefit from?
So I am probably the oddball out here, as I am typically just surrounded by like scientists and lab coats. So I've taken a lot in on the policy side of things, and I'll definitely look forward to following all of your works in the future. So thank you for having me.
As someone not entirely focused on the business side, really interesting to hear both of your perspectives, and been following your work on produced water. So great to connect on all these fronts. Appreciate all of your thoughts.
I think this was fabulous. I mean, having kind of the technology and the market side of things, as well as kind of the policy side of things. I think my key takeaway is that I think it's a great time to push companies and push policymakers for whatever the reason may be that we need to think about circularity, and perhaps it's going to be good for bringing in technological innovations as well as bringing in better economic opportunities for the local communities. So I just think we're in a great time to be having this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just wrap up. I just love the diversity of thought across. So it was a different way of representing conversations in this point of commons of the materials. And I really appreciated Milo's point of talking. We always talk about the carrots, what's the sticks? And I want to go to the audience, and I really appreciate your point. You know, we talk about transactional natures all the time, but we really got to change. And so really having those hard conversations was just a really nice framework. So thank you. And thank you for the great moderating.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this was a lot of fun for me, especially because, as I said, we looked at what do we do when we have waste, but also the idea that, hey, we've got waste and even, produced water that can be a raw input from lithium. I mean, there's a lot here. I mean, we're missing out if we don't apply this. And so the question now becomes, how do we start doing it with the kind of knowledge that's out there? I'm already going to look up the report. You said it came out of Belgium. Yeah. Say it again. The
KU Leuven.
KU Leuven. All right. For those online. But that is part of this idea that we know how to do this. We just have to start doing it. And hopefully people in this room, this panel, we are going to have time for networking. We're going to have time for some refreshments. And as we transition, I just real quick, can you raise your hand if you're a student in the room? Okay. Can you raise your hand if you are hiring in the company that you work with? All right. You might know, all right. All right. So I just found your new best friend, those of you that are still interviewing. But really this idea of sharing ideas with those, I mean, the people here are here because they're interested in this topic. That means each one is probably a subject matter expert in some aspect of this, as well as the folks up here on the stage. Let's make sure we start continuing these conversations. And that's why is there time after here for networking, just so this isn't at anyone or a few questions, but we get to continue to have these conversations. Plus we saw some hands we didn't get to. So let's make sure those folks come talk to us. That's why we're doing the network piece. And with that, I'm going to respectfully hand it over to Wyatt to close us out, and thank all of you for being wonderful in everything we're doing. Got it on.
And a hand for Carrie, please. Thank you, panelists, for this incredible discussion full of opportunity and scoping and knowledge. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. Thank you, guests, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. In the back right, if you're facing the Capitol, there is food and drinks. So please join us for a networking reception. We'll be raising the blinds so you'll be able to see this beautiful view. Follow us on LinkedIn, following this QR code for the exchange. Follow the Earth Commons Institute, see the work that we're doing locally in DC. And thank you again for joining us for the new resource race. Yes.
One last thing I meant to say is thank you, Wyatt, for the brainchild of putting this together, of really thinking about how we can get a diverse set of voices up here that can contribute to this and make sure you all have something to come to that hopefully is worth your time. So thank you, Wyatt. Thank you.